Hi and welcome. I'm going to give my raw water pump a quick servicing. I'm doing this because it started leaking in the boat. First thing you need to do is gain some kind of access to your engine. This is my water pump down here, driven from a little fan belt. Normally if I put my hand underneath it's wet, but at the moment because I haven't used it, it's got salt on it. These two adjuster plate nuts, the lower one and the top one, are what I take off to slide the whole pump and the plate off. This intake hose will have to go, and around the back there's an output hose which will have to go as well, but they can wait for the pump to be removed. If all goes well, a 12mm combination spanner and a flat screwdriver will do the trick. First of all, make sure this seatcock's switched off. The handle has to go across the flow, not with the flow. Then get your 12mm spanner and break your two adjuster plate nuts. You're pushing down on these anti-clockwise, standard setup. It's worthwhile noting these things are quite long. They're about 5 inches, I think, if I can remember. And what you'll find is that you need a bit of area in front of them to be able to withdraw them out. If you haven't got that sort of area, you'll have to take the small 2 bolts off which hold the pump to the adjuster plate instead. You can see the whole pump's loose now. So just go ahead now and spin the bolts out and remove them. You'll soon see the length of them. Looks like they could be longer than I remembered. I think they hold the propeller on the back of the shaft. When you remove the second one, don't worry. Pump's not going anywhere. It's not going to disappear down the bilge or anything. It's still got 2 hoses on it. Second bolt, just as long as the first. So when you get them out, the only thing more or less holding it in place is the fan belt. Loop it off the fan belt and the only restriction will be the hoses that were on each end of it. This is the position you'd need to get it to now in order to do just an impeller while en route. The back plate's held on with 4 bolts on this one because it's a speed seal, 1, 2, 3, 4. Next we need to remove the jubilees, this one on the supply and the other one on the output. I can't access the screw because the adjustment plate's in the way, so I can't get the screwdriver in line. So I'll introduce a 7mm combination spanner, and that can work on the hex and it doesn't need to be in line. It's a bit slower than using a screwdriver on a Jubilee clip, but you can get small ratchet versions of this as well. A little bit of rapid spanner movement. I've loosened the clip now enough to be able to rotate it a little bit, so that I can hopefully get the screwdriver on it and finish undoing it. Once I get it sufficiently loose enough, all I'm going to do is slide it down a pipe out the way, so hopefully it doesn't end up on the floor. Down the bilge. Once I move the clip out the way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a firm grip in one hand of the pump, and I'm going to get a firm grip of the hose in the other hand. And I'm going to try and rotate them, not pull the pipe, but rotate the pipe until I feel it moving. And once I can feel it moving, then I know I can ease it off and let the water drain out the system. A little tip here, if you feel the pipe feel like it tears underneath your hand while you're rotating it, it's the strengthening cords inside the pipe that are breaking, and you really should replace that then. Just let the system drain out into the bilge, there won't be much in it. Now do exactly the same again with the output hose. Final checks before you depart. Seacock still switched off, not been knocked on. Put the 2 bolts back in, the retain and adjusting bolt for the plates, and just leave your hoses dangling, make sure the clips aren't near the end. And now we can have a little look at this little devil. Well, I've ended up needing a 12mm, a 7mm and a flat screwdriver up to now. But at least that'll let you get it off the boat and take it home. Now this is the bottom of the pump here. And you can see the tide mark, or the telltale tide mark, where the actual rusty water's been running down the pump. And if you look very closely just in this area here, you can see that rusty line there where the water's been leaking out the pump. Most pumps try and make sure there's a void between the bearings and the impeller, so to protect the bearings. Well, I take the whole thing back to the workshop. You can clearly see where it's been leaking. Time to make a bit of an examination, I think. Right, well, the obvious things are, this is the pulley bearing end, and the other end is the impeller housing end, this end. And you can clearly see the leak's been coming from the void area between. These plates normally have 6 screws on to undo with a screwdriver, but as you can see on this plate there's just 4 nailed nuts. This is known as a speed seal. You undo 2 of them and take them right out like that. Once you've removed them, the other 2 only need slightly loosening and the plate will slide off like this. This is a bushed plate and has a bush in the centre of it, so be careful not to drop the bush into the bilge if removing while still on the boat. This piece that runs around the side looks like a lump is the camp plate. That's the bit that makes the impeller squash so it sucks and pushes water. Now, using a spiked screwdriver with a 90-degree bend on the back of it, you put it to the bottom and you lever up underneath the impeller to bring it out. There is other ways of bringing them out. This is by far the best tool you can use to remove an impeller, and it's also the best tool you can use to remove the seal out the pump as well. Should you not have one of these tools, well, there's another method you can use using 2 screwdrivers, one either side, but you're actually putting a little bit of pressure on the working face at the front, so you have to be careful. Have a quick look at the tool I use with the 90-degree bend in it. It's excellent. The method that uses the 2 screwdrivers is quite simple. One goes in one side, one goes another, and you draw it up together like that until it comes out. I'm just going to have a quick look at the impeller, see if I can see any visual damage on it, like cracks along the vanes, so the vanes could actually detach and come off. Check that the drive bush inside hasn't delaminated. The pump housing around here might have a gasket or an O-ring seal which needs to be checked as well. Most paper gaskets around here will already have ripped at this point and will need replacing. The advantages of an O-ring are you might get a number of goes out of it. It don't really need replacing until it's gone hard. Although for the cost of an O-ring, I'm quite sure you should replace it every single hit. My method of fishing an O-ring out is just to get a pair of tweezers and push it a little one way or the other, and it makes a little bump, and I put my fingernail in the bump and I lift it out. That way you got no chance of scoring or damaging the recess it come out of. This black thing down here is the seal that's meant to keep the water in the wet side of the pump, which has obviously failed because the water's been coming out here. Now I want to check for play, and I'm going to rock the wheel this way, and I can't feel anything, although there was a bearing noise, so I'll turn it 90 degrees and I'll retry with the same, rocking it, and then after I've rocked it I'll try pulling in and pushing to see if the shaft moves in or out. And it doesn't, it all feels lovely, but there's definitely a funny noise in there somewhere. If you look inside the pump here, you can see something there. It's a little rubber O-ring. This little O-ring has a really technical job to do. When this shaft spins round, the little O-ring, if it gets a drip on it, uses centrifugal force and flings it out the pump. Ideally, it should be located in the centre of this gap rather than to the side. The nut that holds the pulley on It sort of slips in your hand if you try and use hand force holding the pulley and that. So what I do is I get a screwdriver and I hold the pulley still and I give the spanner a whack. And it normally frees the nut the first whack or the second whack. There you go, it's gone. If you don't have a breakdown of all the bits and pieces, put them in an order when you take them off, like nut, and then washer, and then pulley, and then washer, and so on. You're now left with a bearing retaining nut and a circlip to deal with. The circlip that holds the bearings in place, it's got two little eyes in it. The two little eyes are one there and you squeeze them together with the grips to loosen the clip. On the other side we've still got our offending item, the seal, and I'll show you how to get him out dead easy with my funny screwdriver. You stick him in the hole there and you just rotate it 90 degrees and you go round the pump giving it a little switch in each hole, and it pushes up on one side of the pump and the other side it shoves against the seal until all of a sudden the thing just pops up on the other side. So you can see the seal itself there. You can even get a grip on it on this side once it's up sufficiently. Work it a little bit and it'll soon be clear enough for you to get hold of with your fingers, and then just pull it out. If it's a really old seal, the rubber will have dried and hardened and maybe even cracked. If you just push the inside with the screwdriver, it'll show you if it's still flexible or not. Well, this one's still flexible. Just under the lip there, there's a spring. The spring keeps the tension on the seal itself. It's easy enough to get the spring out. If you're careful, you can see if it were broken or not. Well, this one's not broken, but it's very rusty and it's lost its spring, and that doesn't help things. If I just give it a gentle tug, look for the weak link. I'm sure there's going to be one. There it is. It'll just fall apart on a rusty section, and there's no strength or spring going back together in it. As you pull it, it just stays pulled or snaps. Well, to be honest, although it looks worn, it doesn't look like the worst seal I've ever seen. So I'll just clean it up, check the numbers on it, and then give it a measure. You can use the numbers on it to order another one if you haven't already done so beforehand by using the model of your engine and your pump. There's quite a bit of a salty, rusty mess in the back of mine, so I'm just going to clean out the back bit. You can wash it out with a bit of spray or something like that. In this area here, the void, mine's got chunky, crusty, rusty bits in. And then I think I'll dig out that O-ring that's hiding in there. The O-ring, don't forget, is the little bit that chucks the water away when the pump's spinning round so that it doesn't run down to the bearing. Here's the O-ring. Nothing special, just a circle of rubber. The O-ring's real job is to buy you time once the seal's failed, so it doesn't get the bearings straight away, so that you've got a little bit of time to notice. This little devil looks after you and gives you quite a few extra hours. Very mucky in there. I'm surprised this pump still goes round. Next we need to remove the circlip. Put the pliers in the two little eyes, squeeze together, and with your fingers keeping hold of it, lift it off. Then put it with your other bits nice. Right, we need to take the bearing retaining nut off next, so you'll need a big spanner for that, a 19-ish on a ring, and you need an open ender to stick on the shaft itself to lock the shaft, so you can take the nut off. Now this is special, this. What looks weird in what I'm doing now? Give yourself a pat on the back if you spotted what was weird about that. Well, it was quite simply weird because it's a left-hand thread. That means it goes the opposite way than an ordinary nut. And if you look on it, that up the top there is telling you left-hand thread. Next, I normally take off the mounting plate. It just makes the pump easier to handle, and it's a doddle to take off, just two quick nuts. Some of you might have even left the mounting plate on the engine. In order to push the shaft out correctly, you should put the load down to the working flange, but you need special tools to do things like this, and we don't all have them. So there is other ways of doing it. You could A, make one, or B, go to the toolbox and find yourself a suitable socket. and the socket itself can sit on the face ring. Bit dangerous for your face ring, but it can sit there anyway and you can push into that. Any good fitting tube that goes along the bottom there and the bearing can slip into it will do fine though. Once you've found a suitable socket that the bearing will slip into, take it then to the press. Put it on the press and you're going to shove it out into the socket. The press will end up pushing it down about 15 millimeters before it drops into the socket. And as soon as it drops into the socket, stop pushing. If you feel any pressure doing this, stop, but otherwise, there she goes. Well, it doesn't look very nice in there. Bit of a rusty looking shaft, so I'll pull the bearings off and see what we've got. After removing the primary bearing off the shaft, we're left with the shaft with the small bearing on it, followed by a little circlip, and then the sleeve which is on top, which is a spacer, which controls the distance that the primary bearing can slide down the shaft. This is the order the bits come off: seal, small bearing, circlip, spacer, big bearing, nut, big circlip. There they are spread out. The shaft wasn't that clean. I've given it a clean with some 1200 wet and dry. This is the state of my little bearing. I've pulled the rubber side off it with a little screwdriver and found that the actual bearings are seized to the inner bearing run. The outside one will move, but there's a millimetre or so of play in it. So it's probably been floating around and missing it most of the time. When I poke the shaft in on the end of the bearing, I can see the inside movement, and it's quite considerable. And I think this has been the responsible item for the seal being under load and allowing water to get out. What a mess. Alright, let's have a quick look what this O-ring does. All it does, it just gets shoved down on the shaft, and it's got no particular place. It's where you're going to leave it, it's going to stay. But when it's working and it's spinning round, there's these little plastic tangs that stick out here and here and here. And what they do is when there's a drip on the O-ring, the drip touches one of them and it flicks out the side. Dead simple system. I used a 6-sided 32mm socket to push the bearings out into, and as you can see, it fits perfect. That's what you need to know to use the socket, that they will fit into that area you're pushing it into. With the bearings out, it's quite straightforward. You just start measuring them up and recording the data you get. The bit out of diameter is the outside of a bearing, so you read it, and once you're happy with it, you write it down. They're normally in whole millimetres on most bearings. Inside diameter is obvious, it's the inside of the bearing, and the width is just across the bearing. That's the specification for a bearing, and then do that again on the smaller bearing. Record your width. Inside diameter, if it's a bit rusty in there, it mightn't be true, and the shaft itself will give you a better inside diameter than that. So due to the rust, I'm not happy there, so all I'll do is I'll put a question mark down for now. But I guess it's exactly the same as the big bearing, which I was happy with, which is 12mm. And then again the outside diameter, which is quite easy to read. Now you can double check these by taking the inside diameter of the pump where the bearings sit, but the shaft gives you the inside diameter of the bearings themselves. I've cleaned the shaft up with wet and dry and 1200 paper. And when I measure the shaft, it's 12, so the inside of the bearings therefore have to be 12. There's a very small line worn into the shaft from the old seal. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, but you can just about feel it with your thumbnail or your fingernail. The small circlip fits just here to control linear location of the shaft. I try with the vernier to see if there's a noticeable difference that could be measured for where the little tiny lip mark is, but it can't be measured. The only thing left to measure now is the seal. So I'm going to measure the outside diameter of the seal, and I can check that against where it fits in the pump if I have to. And then I need to measure the width of the seal. So it's 24 on the outside, and then measuring the width of the seal. There's no sense in measuring the inside diameter of the seal because it's spongy. But we know the outside diameter of the shaft's 12 millimeters, so the inside of the seal has to be a 12 millimeter seal. I tried the seal on the shaft to see if it still fits with a bit of tension, and even without the spring it feels like it has a good fit. So I think the major cause of this leak was the second bearing failing, resulting in the shaft not remaining true and putting pressure on the sides of the seal. Next I go off to my favourite bearing site to order some bearings. Simply Bearings is an excellent site, easy to use with brilliant service. Type in the boxes here your bearing sizes from the home page and press go, and the options will come up, and the options are very clear and it's an easy system to use. First check the correct sizes up on the top there, and if so, select the bearings or seals you want. You then get a number of bearings varying in price and quality, so make your choice and then move on to your second bearing. Again, back to the beginning, punch the numbers in, new bearing pops up, scroll through what's there and again select the one you want. Then back to the beginning again, start all over again and find your seal, and when you've selected your seal you're ready to pay for it all. Well, I've bought 2 water pump repair kits here, and both of them are coming in at 44.40 to my door. That's pretty good going. Right, let's get it all together. First thing you need to make sure is the plate we're going to push with, the shaft will fit through it clearly, but the inside of the bearing can't fit through the hole. That hole needs to support the inside of the bearing, which is that part there, and this one does. But what I'm saying is when we put this bearing on this plate here, when we press on the inside of it with the shaft, the load is transferred on the inside and not the outside of the bearing, if that makes any sense. Next, with everything cleaned, the first thing I do is get a bit of grease and put it on the shaft. I just like to think that I don't want anything to pick up while it's being pushed along. So grease the shaft and stick it in place. I'm going to use the flat end of this shaft, which is the shaft that drives the impeller, to push it by rather than the thread at this particular point. I need to push this shaft that far down that the groove for the circlip appears on the other side of the bearing. You can see the groove just about to disappear into the bearing now. Now you don't need to go miles past this, so I don't. I normally stop and have a look where I am and see if I've gone far enough, because at this point, once you've passed where you need to go and you put the circlip on, you're going to have to push it back using the threaded end, which is the bit I don't like. Well, it hasn't shown its face yet, so we're going to have to push it a little bit further. Right, so back into its place. And again, bring it down and shove it to an estimated guess to be hopefully to get the circlip groove out the other side of the bearing. Should be somewhere around there. Let's have a look. With a little bit of luck. Yeah, there it is, nice and clear. So we need to put him on there. Let's get the circlip pliers. Nice easy job. Give him a little bit of a squeeze. Put your finger on, always damp it, bring it to its place and let it snap into its hole. If it's not snapped into its hole, just shove it along with a screwdriver or something. This next bit is the bit that always goes against my grain. It's pushing on the thread. I hate pushing on the thread. So I take an ordinary nut and I stick it on the end of the thread till it's about level with the head, so that the load is passed from both sides and hopefully the thread doesn't squash. And we just bring the press back into play, and we're going to allow it to rest on the nut on the top of the thread while it pushes the shaft down into the bearing, and hopefully we'll stop as soon as we feel like there's a little bit of tension of the circlip touching the bearing. Right, up to now we've made sure that we've put no load whatsoever on those bearings in that new race, and everything feels lovely. Ready for the next stage. So we're going to take this nut off, or sacrificial nut at this particular point in time, and this sleeve needs to go on. But before he goes on, our spacer sleeve, we're going to grease it up so that it's nice under there and hopefully Mr. Rust's held back. And then it's sleeve on, and then we're ready to go back into the press. Okay, a little bit more grease. Get our new big bearing or primary bearing and drop the primary bearing on. Now it's going to be on the same hole, so it's going to be putting its pressure on the inside race rather than the outside race of the bearing. Let's bring the press back into play and let's shove that along until it just touches the spacer between. If you get to know your press, you normally feel the resistance change, and that's the particular point to stop rather than overdoing anything. Check everything looks and feels good at this particular point in time, that nothing's been damaged in the process of putting it together and everything runs smoothly. Next I get the pump housing, give it a final clean, and I put it down on a piece of cardboard, the cardboard to protect the working face there. You know what I'm going to do to it next. I'm going to get a finger full of grease and fill it up. Going to make sure all these areas inside there are well lubed. Now I always choose to fit my shaft and bearings as one piece, like a cassette if you like, and that actually flies in the face of the correct way of doing things. So you may wish to adopt a different procedure. Mine may be made up of a bit of laziness, but a bit of convenience. But also, I've been doing it like this for years and it seems to work. I'll tell you what I'm doing wrong and then I'll explain why. Firstly, I locate my little cassette shaft that I've put together with bearings and shaft into place and ready for pushing in. In order for me to push this shaft in, the outside of this bearing is the area where I need to apply the effort, but I don't. I apply it on the inside using a socket that fits over it and fits on the centre section of the bearing, just there. This method to me is best. Both bearings as they're pushed into place will have some load on the actual balls, which you want to avoid most of the time at all costs. But even if I push this one in from the outside at the top, it would still transfer pressure to the balls via the shaft and the bottom bearing being pushed into place using the balls. So it seems like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, and then this is just convenient, so I go for this method. Again, I stop soon as I feel resistance. Circlip next to keep it all together. I use a pair of 90-degree circlip pliers because it's easier doing things from the side. And I always tell anyone who's doing a circlip, keep a finger or a thumb on it while you're squeezing it together, because they can go puting and disappear across the room and never to be seen again. And then just push it down and you'll hear it go snap into place. Give it a twist and make sure everything feels nice. While I think on, let me show you the tool I use to do all this work, my bent screwdriver. It's actually designed like that, and I don't know what it's called, but I'm sure you can get them at any automotive tool shop. Okay, back to the pump. What's next? That's right, we've got a little diddy O-ring to stick in there, haven't we? You know now just how important that little O-ring is, and I find when a lot of people do this job, it's the one thing they forget to put back. So again, I grease the shaft, I get the O-ring and I just slide them down, and I'm not bothered about too much grease being anywhere, because normally it'll just flick off around the pump and it's not going to be that much grease at the end of the day. Don't forget, we're not just shoving the O-ring in and leaving it. Using the little voids in the side, you can see where the O-ring is, so with a screwdriver, push him down and you want him right in the middle of that window. 50-50 as you look at him either side of him, and he's in the most precise place he can be then. Just turn the shaft a little, prod him down a little until you got him all right, and if you think you've gone too far, you can shove him back. Next job's to fit the seal. The spring's going to be inside with the wet side, which doesn't sort of make sense, but that's the way a seal works. So I completely pack that side of it with grease so that no water's going to be touching that spring for a long time. That grease is going to be there for years. So no corrosion, hopefully, for a long time for that little spring. Right, get him ready, completely cover him in grease, and then, obviously, he's going on the shaft. The seals are dead easy to fit, but I've seen people trying to knock them in with screwdrivers, which scares the pants off me. You just get a 12mm washer if you've got a 12mm shaft. Stick the washer on the shaft and push him down. And with thumb pressure alone, you should be able to get that into place. And if you can't with your own thumbs, slide a socket over the top of the shaft and over the washer and give it a couple of taps with a damp mallet. And don't leave the washer in there, make sure you get him out. Next thing to go on is our retaining nut for the bearings. Not forgetting he's a funny Fred, he's lefty. So it looks a little bit weird when you're putting him on, but there you go. And to tighten him up, you're only going to nick him into place with the big ring spanner and the little open ender. The very fact that you've got to tighten it up using an 8mm open ender is going to restrict the amount of load you can get on. And the one thing you don't want to do is be rounding that at the top. Next, it's the flat washer goes on, followed by the pulley. Locate the drive, then the next washer, little bit of grease on the thread, and then we stick our nylock nut on. Then grab hold of the pulley itself and spin the nut down. Yeah, but forgot the mountain bracket. I had to take the pulley off and back on again. Tightening up this nut here, I put a fan belt round and I get a big pair of grips and I grip the fan belt so as not to be anywhere near the pulley, and then I nick the nut up. A simple way of doing it. Alright, we're going to stick an impeller in it next. So check it's all still lovely and free. Turn it round, and this area here, obviously it has to be clean, and me, it's going to be greased. This stuff doesn't attack rubber at all that I use. It's a blue grease made by Johnson and Evinrude, and it's fantastic stuff, and I've used it for 30 years. It's the dogs. So I grease everything up that's going to go in here now. The impeller rotates anti-clockwise, so that's the way I'm going to sort of stick it back in. If you're using a second-hand one, it goes back in the rotation that it came out normally. My method's just to bend the one vein up that is on the cam area and then push it in. Normally your thumb presses enough to push it in then. Oh, you've greased everything, you see. Check it's all working nicely. If I'm using the old O-ring, the first thing I do is clean it. I clean it by running it round through my fingers to make sure there's no crusty bits of salt on it anywhere or corrosion. And if it still feels like a good O-ring, then I'll reuse it. But before I reuse it, I'll get grease and I'll grease it. Grease does two things here. Helps seal, and it also helps it stick in place when you put it in the ring, so that if you've got to service or access it at any point, the O-ring don't drop off and jump in the bilge on you. And then after the O-ring's in, and I can feel he's nice and proud, because you need a proud O-ring to actually be a seal, then I'm happy with him. So the next thing is the plate. So a little dab of bearing grease there on the white bearing. Drop the centre plate back in. Make sure it all feels smooth and no grittiness behind it. And again, you know, I'm going to put the grease on. It's going back on. And because this one's a speed seal, and it's basically going to slide on going downwards onto the bottom two bolts, we need to put the bottom two nail nuts in first. So we stick them in with our fingers to get ready for the plate. The rest, you know, a little bit of grease on them, a little bit of grease on the next one. Stick them both into place. Then the plate should just drop down onto them. Then grease up the last two threads on the last two nail nuts. Stick them into place. And then when they're all in, tighten them down. Don't forget you tighten them diagonally, so it's And because of my greasy fingers, I finally tighten with a rag. Now spin it clockwise, make sure it's all beautiful and it's ready to go back on the boat. All as you have to do is refit it back in the boat on the reverse order that you took it off. So it bolts out. Check the hoses, make sure they're all right on the ends. Make sure your Jubilee clips are actually on the hoses. Get the pump and fit the output hose to it. Tighten up the clips, fit the input hose to it. bring the clips down, tighten up the clips. When the clips are all in place, then you can put the pump in place. The first thing you want to do is hook on the fan belt, and then you need to stick the 2 long retaining bolts into place, and just with finger pressure on the bottom of the pump, tighten the 2 bolts up evenly. And mine's fitted with a high level filter, so I have to take the top off that and prime the system. So with the seacock still closed, I'll fill this up with water, so there's water down the pipe to prime the pump. You just fill the whole cup up till it overflows. It's that simple. And then just refit the lid on top. Now you can open the seacock. And then we can give it a go and see if the engine starts. There you can see straight away the engine starting and the water's flowing through the filter system, so you know the pump's doing something. Then I'm going to nip outside and I'm going to have a look at the exhaust, and I'm going to say to myself, there's enough water coming out or there's not enough water coming out, but I'm going to watch it for a couple of minutes. After I've run it for 10 minutes or so, I'll be going back inside, switching it off and checking that there's no loss at the pump. I've got no drips, no leaks, and I'll keep my eye on it for a couple of weeks till I get used to it and think it's a successful job. I hope this gives some of you the confidence to crack on and sort your own water pump problems out. Thanks very much. Bye.